Hello, my name is Gabe. Now, I tend to focus on fictional stories. And I analyze them and give my thoughts and whatever mindset, whatever lessons we can learn from them. But every once in a while, something in real life happens. It goes beyond what fiction can show us. A real story. And this is Real Stories. And tonight, I want to talk about Totally Not Mark versus Toei animation. Now first off, you might be thinking, aren't you a little late on talking about it? And yes, everyone else put their thoughts on the table when the whole thing just started. And I respect them for doing that. But I'm not here to put my hot takes or anything. I want to take what we can learn from this going forward. And in order to do that, I needed to wait until the story was, well, over to start looking at it and talking about it on this channel. So, first off, who is Totally Not Mark? Totally Not Mark is a YouTuber and whose channel primarily focuses on manga reviews. Not anime manga, but all the same, he does use content from the anime on occasion. Not really important. A good chunk of his content focused on Dragon Ball and One Piece, properties whose anime adaptations are owned by the animation studio Toei. And this is where the story begins. Totally Not Mark, who from here on I'll just refer to as Mark, despite the instructions in the name, was planning for December to be dedicated to everyone's favorite wall crawler, Spider-Man. Had this whole plan to review every live-action movie up until the release of No Way Home. But that was put on kibosh when, after having only completed one episode of that series, the vast majority of his channel was deleted. Or rather, removed via copyright strike by Toei Animation. Over 180 videos gone like that. As you can imagine, that was devastating. And it was. No, this happens all the time to one or two videos, but to have it happen on such a high-profile thing to a whole channel, well, it's newsworthy, headline-worthy even. Naturally, everyone in the industry reacted. Of course they did. They were angry. And we'll get more on that a little bit later. But, at first, Totally Not Mark tried pleading, hoping that he could reach people in Japan, including the creator of One Piece himself, and have them maybe speak on his behalf. However, that's when the first and really important hurdle to this story came up. A culture gap. What to us in the West seemed like an unforgivable transgression was just part of the expectations in Japan. To them, not to all of, but to many of the people in Japan, Mark's decision to fight it in the first place, some might even say to even made those videos, was the unforgivable transgression. And so ultimately, realizing that he was going to get nowhere by pleading, he deleted both videos dealing with the subject and released one last conclusion saying that he was going to drop it and see what he could do moving forward. Thankfully, according to his own video, according to Mark himself, not all hope was lost. A little while later, someone from YouTube approached him and agreed to work with him to attempt to communicate with Toei to see if some agreement could be reached. Ultimately, however, one could not. As ultimately, Mark couldn't see any rhyme or reason to the videos Toei were okay with, and the ones they were not. So, pulling a few strings, Mark's contact at YouTube offered him another option that I'm going to be talking more about in a bit: region locking. To explain simply, technically, Toei weren't in the right. They somehow didn't go through the proper channels, which I didn't even know there were proper channels, to actually properly initiate the copyright strike. Meaning, Mark could easily get his videos reinstated. However, then Toei could go through the proper channels and just legitimately remove them anyways. So, instead of dealing with that hassle, YouTube region locked Mark's channel. His videos can no longer be viewed in Japan. Meaning, if Toei wants to fight Mark on this, they have to do so via Western laws, not Japanese ones. Which is a win, sort of. There is a lot to dissect in this story. There is. But first, we need to deal with the elephant in the room. Totally Not Mark was not the beginning of this story, and nor will it be the end. To help understand this, we need to flash back a few years ago. Anyone on YouTube probably remembers this. Nintendo. This was a tumultuous time. This was a rough time for gaming channels everywhere. As YouTube's new copyright systems were being put into place for the very first time, a question was looming over every YouTuber's head. What are we allowed to do, and what aren't we? Ultimately, for most channels, like review channels, like Totally Not Mark's in fact, or well, basically any channel, everything was covered under fair use. But then came the ultimate sticking point: gameplay channels. It's annoyingly harder to describe those channels as under fair use. However, most companies realized there was benefit to allowing these gameplay channels to show their content. And because of that benefit, they ultimately decided it would be in their best interest to ignore it. Which is what they did. Ignoring and oftentimes embracing it. Though it should be noted, and I think not a coincidence, the companies that were even holdouts on the very last second, even some of them even to this day, were all Japanese. Sega had some odd rules, and still do. But of course, the most famous, or rather infamous holdout was Nintendo. Nintendo tried everything to try and figure out to basically stop the gameplay channels of their content from existing, or at the very least control them. First, they tried outright striking them out, and for the most part, that, well, failed drastically, because as soon as they made that move, that massive move in the West, people stopped covering them. And this is important, and we'll get to why later. Just remember that I said that. And when people stopped covering them, they stopped selling. So, not quite ready to give up the fight, Nintendo tried to create a creators program, which I'm sure everyone can agree was awful, but it didn't help. People still just, instead of joining it, didn't cover their content. And they lost. Ultimately, Nintendo was forced to concede. If Nintendo wanted a continued presence in the West, they would need to just suck it up and let people upload their content. They didn't want to, obviously, but they basically had no choice. As you can see, this is very similar to what happened with Toei. But now we come to a question. Why? Why do we care so much about these issues? why is it that us in the West were so affected by these things that in Japan they can just ignore, that it ultimately hurt Nintendo? And ultimately I suspect will still hurt Toei in the end, but we'll get to that. That's because in the West, the way we consume content is through and for discourse. Things get bigger here because people talk about them. Not just YouTube channels, but they are a primary source of it, but everybody. Whether it be shows like Game of Thrones or Squid Game, or games like Undertale, and even Minecraft. They don't get big just on their merits, though don't get me wrong, they definitely have merits. They get big because we talk about them. It isn't a matter of us disliking things that aren't being talked about, it's that we don't know about them. There's thousands of different things we could be watching or playing or reading. And the fact is, for most people, we don't have time to decide for ourselves, with no help, what to watch or play. So we depend on discussion. This is why people like Mark, of Totally Not Mark, reviewers, Let's Plays, why they're so vitally important here. And why the story about Toei and other anime companies isn't over by a long shot. Toei versus Mark here made the first dent, but not the last one. As we have just established, media in the West cannot survive without discourse. And if discourse about something is being discouraged, well, we're just not going to talk about it. This will see an impact further down the line. For companies like Toei and other companies who choose to act in the same way. Whilst the companies who don't, at least in the West, are going to find unbridled success. Just like what happened with Let's Plays. The question is this something those companies are going to choose to embrace? Or are they going to choose to disregard the Western market altogether? Well, the answer is, I don't think they outright can. But all the same, the answer here is, at least my prediction, if I had to make one, is I think it's going to be something in between. But, like with Let's Plays, and how they've kind of, in their concept, spread to Japan, I think that something in between is going to ultimately affect Japan as well. You cannot give someone a taste of freedom and then take it away. That is something I firmly believe in. And that is part of the philosophy that affects this whole story. So, there will come a time, mark my words, whether it be with Mark or some other YouTuber, where another anime company is going to be in the headlines, or even Toei themselves, because of this exact same type of conflict. And as this keeps happening, we're going to get ever closer to the conclusion to this story. The true conclusion. And I solemnly hope it ends in a way that makes everyone happy. Thank you for listening. I hope I covered the story well and worth your attention. If you enjoyed this video, why not leave it a like? If you want to see more like it, do subscribe. But more importantly than anything else, have a good night.